just as quickly as it started, it's over. The Pacers go after Deandre Ayton, present him an offer sheet, make some moves, and then the Suns match and will keep Ayton. What all happened? What was the timeline? What does it mean for the Pacers both as a franchise and as their current roster? We'll break it all down today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News, and we've got a doozy of a show to get to today. This was going to be about the Pacers' pursuit and interest in signing Deandre Ayton and what the next 48 hours could look like, but instead this will be about the Pacers' quick pursuit in Ayton, the signing of Ayton, and then immediately the Suns match, meaning Ayton will not be a Pacer. What happened? What was the timeline? What does it mean for the Pacers roster and franchise? All these things will be answered on this show. It was very, very fascinating, and there's going to be a lot of Q&A that comes out of this because a lot of people are involved in this process. So let's run through a timeline. I think that is, rarely do I think timelines are helpful. It's just a lot of information. But today, it is very important, given everything that happened, given all the parties involved, and given the scene setting it will do for the Pacers. 2:57 p.m., Adrian Wojnarowski drops the report. The Pacers are signing Deandre Ayton to an offer sheet. 4 years, $133 million, the maximum amount the Pacers were allowed to pay Deandre Ayton this season would have started at $30.9 million and scaled up over the next 4 years. So there we go. The Pacers are doing the thing that they've been rumored to do. Ayton finally gets his deal, and we're off. And then, not long after, 3:48, less than an hour later, Woj says, so far, Suns haven't shown an interest in negotiating sign and trade on Ayton with the Pacers. And because Ayton had not signed with the Pacers yet, this could have turned into a sign and trade. And then he said, the expectation remains Pheonix will match the record offer sheet once it's signed. That was less than an hour later. He reported the Pacers will reportedly offer Ayton, and the Suns will likely match. Before he even has signed it, that is the reporting. And then I start thinking about this, and as I've reported on this podcast many times, the Pacers did not have maximum space to sign Deandre Ayton to a maximum offer sheet, which always was, to me, the path that made the most sense for the Pacers to pursue him. Instead of giving stuff up, just clear some space for this guy. So then, even after that reporting, Woj says the Pacers are waiving Dwayne Washington and waiving and stretching 3 players who arrived in the Malcolm Brogdon trade: Malik Fitz, Juwan Morgan, and Nick Stauskas. If you listened to yesterday's show, maybe 2 days ago, earlier this week, I talked about how the Pacers can create max cap space. That was the route they could have done that involved no other teams. They could do it by their own accord and not have to trade with another team, not have to come to an agreement, not have to potentially salary dump someone. So they did it. And in my head at that time, I was thinking the Pacers wouldn't do that with concrete knowledge the Suns would match at the time. And that will become important later. If they thought the Suns would match for sure, there's no point of them jumping all over this as quickly as they did. So then the waivers get reported by Woj. The day goes on, and the Pacers announce those waivers later in the day. I got the email at 8:18 p.m. that happened. And that was right after Woj reported that Ayton signed the deal. 8:01 p.m. is when Woj said Ayton has signed a deal with the Pacers. So no sign and trade. The Pacers and Suns are going through the match process, 48 hours to decide. And we didn't even get close to 48 hours of thinking about what this could look like, or talking about it on this podcast, or workshopping why or why not the Suns would consider doing this. 8:17, immediately before the Pacers, basically the exact same time as this all became official from the Pacers side, Shams Charania says the Suns have matched it. It's over. They matched it right when it came in the door. They got the offer sheet that the Pacers signed him to, and they said, yep, we match. We're done. So that's the whole saga. The Pacers went after Deandre Ayton. They cleared cap space. They cleared the space. They inked him to a max deal. And boom, the Suns just matched it immediately. No Deandre Ayton for the Pacers. He is headed to the Suns. This was fascinating to see unfold in just a matter of 6 hours, less than 6 hours to see that. So big picture, what actually happened here? Because this is all very fast that this went from, wow, the Pacers could get DeAndre Ayton to, okay, this is over. They cleared space and don't have him. Look, I think the big thing, and this is what I said at first when this happened, because I never really thought Ayton made sense for the Pacers at this time, but they went after it. This was very un-Pacersy, which was a fascinating part of this story to me. Beyond their potential chase of Ayton and making their team really solid right now with a young base, the Pacers went after it. They never do this stuff. And I will talk about this more in the second segment in the franchise ripples. But for a team that, even since the cap spike in 2016, Brogdon got 84 million, Sabonis got 84-ish million, Turner got 80 million. The Pacers do not pay these massive sums of money. Jermaine O'Neal got a ton of money from the Pacers a long time ago. Paul George got a bunch of money in the early 2010s. This is 133 million we're talking about. Easily the biggest deal per year, especially the Pacers would have ever signed. Big moment for the franchise to step up with that kind of money. Big moment. And it was a restricted free agent, something Herb Simon has said on the record, the team owner in the past, a process he is not a fan of. He does not like doing this. Monumental step for the Pacers. And I thought when they did this, when they went the route of the match, I thought it made sense for the Suns to match it because he was the first overall pick and a really good player and a key fit for that franchise in recent playoff runs. It made the most sense for them to keep him, and it made the most sense for the Suns to not let this get away. So why could this have happened this way? Why would the Suns not have just straight up negotiated with Ayton? Well, who knows? But the biggest theory I could have, and I was talking to Scott McNeilis about this. If you don't know who Scott is, he knows the salary cap better than I do. I bounce a lot of my thoughts and theories off of him. Scott, if you're listening, you're the best. But you're on vacation, so I hope you're not. Anywho, so doing this, obviously a very big deal for the Pacers. The Suns matching always felt likely. What this does for the Suns is they now have DeAndre, if they came to the table and they said, DeAndre, we don't want to pay you the max. They could have paid him 5 years and a bunch more money than this. This, by matching another team's deal, kind of limits the value of Ayton for their team. Maybe they wanted this. That's not what Scott said, but that is a possible thing here. But the other part of this that Scott was saying is perhaps there was some poor communication here from Phoenix's side that they would match any deal. Because if that's the case, where they never made it perfectly clear or really got it out there to the right people that they would match anything up to any amount, then it would have made more sense why the Pacers were doing this pursuit that ended so quickly. Because the Suns get him for cheaper, and I'm sure they're a little happy about that, given how last season ended and some apparent rift between the franchises. But I mean, it's just fascinating that this can go the way it did, where the Pacers have all this interest and they're clearing money and they're cutting a player who was in the rotation for a bunch of last season just for it to end on the same day. I think there was some part of the Suns picture here that was missing to me, and I think poor communication could be a factor. And I think the Suns actually wanting to have Ayton on a little bit cheaper of a deal could be a factor here as well, because again, their max for Ayton was much higher. They could have given him a 5-year deal. They could have given him 8% raises instead of 5. You stack those up, suddenly you're paying DeAndre Ayton somewhere between 35 and 40 million more than what they will now have to pay him. So this could have some suckage for the Suns, right? I talked about this on the Ayton show earlier this week with Brendan Clean. Like, this could have a 15% trade kicker that makes it harder, for the Suns to trade Ayton in the future. This could have some funky bonuses that are really annoying, or likely or unlikely for Pheonix. This could have a poison pill payment structure where the Suns have to pay him a bunch of his salary right when the season starts. I think that was in Otto Porter's contract. He was the last guy to sign a big restricted free agency offer sheet with another team. There are a lot of ways that this could suck for Pheonix, but it still could be less total money and less painful for them as a tax team than giving him a bunch. And maybe that is ultimately a result that they were okay with, and that's why they let it get to this point. Maybe maybe they didn't want to have a strained relationship sort of situation where this gets to this point. But perhaps they said, you know what, we're okay with having him be on a floor for 133 deal, 4-year, 133 million. So if it comes to that, it comes to that. Let's just wait this out, because they had match power the whole time. They had the ways to keep Ayton in any way. And now we've reached the point where the Pacers, who wanted DeAndre Ayton enough to the point that they shed salary and spent over $30 million on one player, do not end up with that player. Franchise historic day to me for the Pacers. They never do stuff like this. This changes my calculus on how they approach restricted free agency on players' interest, not necessarily in the franchise, but playing with their current core. Tyrese Halliburton was cited in one of Woj's pieces on ESPN as being a guy that Deandre Ayton wanted to play with. A lot of factors that kind of shift the calculus of how you think about the Pacers free agency. And you have to think about that going forward. It could just be a one-off, right? One guy who doesn't have a ton of options and is interested in the Pacers. It could just be a one-off, but it also could be, the Pacers do not go after restricted free agents. They did. They spend a bunch more money than they usually do on a free agent, even though they didn't get him. That happened. These things matter. And this has franchise rippling effects. And I want to talk about those both in terms of what it means for the way the Pacers approach free agency and what it means for their situation on a salary cap front, because they did make other moves to make this happen. So no DeAndre Ayton for the Pacers, but it still has ramifications on the franchise and the roster. That will be the next two segments here. Let's dive into what this could mean for the Pacers franchise. Before we do that, though, really quickly, I would like to talk about BetOnline.net, your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball, all over at BetOnline.net, who are your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. They've got NBA lines for Summer League up. There are 2 games later tonight I can see on there: Timberwolves, Nets, and Blazers, Rockets. And I'm sure if you're listening to this on Friday that they have the Pacers' 4th Summer League game lines up there. They play at 9 p.m. on Friday. You can get all those lines over at betonline.net, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to sign up and learn more about the trends in the action over at BetOnline, because betonline.net is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, this one's easy. Locked On Suns. Brendan Clean will break down the Pheonix side of this saga, of this situation, what it means for the Suns, Ayton, the pursuit of Kevin Durant, all the factors that were discussed on Tuesday's podcast here on Locked On Pacers, as the Pacers' reported pursuit ended up getting pushed out more and more every day. Look, what does this mean for the Pacers franchise? Because, like I just said, this is monumental to me that the Pacers did this. Even though nothing will come of it, nothing happens. Herb Simon said last year, I was in the room, I was one of the people who got invited to hear him speak about his franchise and his thoughts. He said he thinks this franchise can get top-level free agents. And he said he will spend. And he has spent a lot on like structural things like the practice facility, and they were right at the tax last year, top 15 in spending until the trade deadline. But still, the perception mattered, and some cheapness in the past mattered, and their lack of ability to get top free agents in the past mattered. And so this moment does kind of make him seem correct to some extent a little bit, even though, again, it could just be a one-off thing. I think this is a monumental thing for the Pacers franchise that this happened at all. The fact that they put their money where their mouth is and were willing to spend big on a top free agent who was willing to come to the franchise says a lot about both their change in stance, which I put in my piece about this before it became official that Ayton was being matched. It says a lot about their change in stance, and it says a lot about the allure of playing with a young franchise like this. It allows you to attract young talent when you have young talent on your team, and the Pacers were able to get it done. Now, from a franchise fallout perspective with DeAndre Ayton, because let's go back in time for a second. February, trade deadline. Pacers end up getting Halliburton, but they did inquire and speak with the Suns about an Ayton trade in February. And that was kind of the first tip. I did a podcast back in May about some of the bigger Pacers offseason rumors, and I talked about Ayton then, all the way back over a month and a half ago, because of that trade deadline conversations. Those can often be the seeds for interest that pops up later. In this case, it was. Why does that matter now? Well, because by the nature of the way this transaction went down, the Pacers signing Ayton, the Suns matching the deal, DeAndre Ayton now cannot be traded to the Pacers for a full year. He can, this whole coming season, even when he becomes trade eligible in January, he cannot be dealt to the Pacers. That interest cannot happen for at least another year. He also has, in general, this kind of sucks for the Suns. I should have included this last segment. Trade veto powers the entire season. He could not be traded at all if he says, no, I'm good this season. So we'll see how that fits into this whole equation. But the Pacers and Ayton and any sort of interest they have of uniting as parties cannot continue until a full year from now. And for the Suns, they could recoup assets that they couldn't have in this trade. And in fact, then they will not be bound by a base year compensation. and they could take back more money or more substantial stuff in a deal. That might be preferable to them depending on how this season goes, but that is certainly a franchise fallout sort of moment, is that this is now over. The Pacers do not have Ayton. They cannot trade for Ayton, and their interest dating back to February is now capooshed until at least the summer of 2023. Now what? Now what for the Pacers as a franchise? We'll get to the roster specifically, Dwayne Washington, Myles Turner, a couple other guys, next segment. But for the Pacers specifically, what's the deal? They have max cap space. Look, they got to max space by making some moves, and they signed Ayton with that space. And then Ayton gets matched, and he goes to Pheonix. So the Pacers still have that max space. They have 15 players under contract now, which is a roster size, although they don't have their two-way guys set yet. If you count their camp guys, they have 19. They still could get one more. And they have $31 million in space. They are under the salary floor. That is also noteworthy when thinking about what the Pacers could do. Now, are they going to for sure immediately splurge on a free agent and spend that money? No. There are a lot of things they could do. But in terms of their roster situation right now, they have max space. They have 15 guys under contract. Well, they have 31 million in space, which is max space for a player with 6 or less years of service. But effectively, given the free agents left, that is max space. They have 15 guys under contract, 31 million in space, and they're under the salary floor. Now, another thing that happened here, the Pacers signed somebody. They signed Ayton, even though they don't get him. They used cap space. That matters. They went under the cap, which means they renounced trade exceptions. They renounced their mid-level exception. They are now a cap space team. Dunzo decided. They lose the trade exception they got in the Malcolm Brogdon trade. They also lose the remaining part of the Jeremy Lamb trade exception and the Edmund Sumner trade exception in this. And so beyond their cap space, they have the room mid-level exception available to them as well. But they are now done with trade exceptions. They lose them by going under to do this. So aren't for sure using the 30 million in space now or soon or all of it even. They could roll it over to next season, which could be smart. There's a much better free agent class next year. There's also a lot more teams with cap space next year. But it's an interesting spot having that 30 million in space. And it kind of, if you listen to yesterday's podcast, there are a lot of things the Pacers can still do this summer. Andrew Nembhard still unsigned, Kendall Brown still unsigned, but that won't get them to the salary floor. There's no max guys left, though. The free agency class left is not that strong. So this means the Pacers could still be a team that takes guys in a salary dump, if that's Westbrook, if that's pieces in a Donovan Mitchell trade, if that's pieces in a Kevin Durant trade, whatever that could be. There's still a lot to be settled in the NBA this offseason. The Pacers could still pounce on that and make it a benefit for them. I talked about that with Kevin Durant on a podcast last week. I'll do that with Donovan Mitchell on a podcast next week because the Jazz and Nets have different situations. But that is one way for the Pacers to still use the space and roster spots that they have, is to take in some crappy money in a trade and acquire assets that way. Having max space is not necessarily a bad thing, even though you have no one to use it on left. I think that is something they could still do, is take on crappy money, grab some assets, because there are no max guys left. But that doesn't mean their free agency pursuits should be over. I mean, them and San Antonio have a ton of space left. The Pistons have a little space left. And there's not a lot of good free agents left. So obviously spending all that money on one guy is far-fetched. Colin Sexton is still out there. He doesn't really make sense for the Pacers with all their guards right now. But there are other okay free agents. Eric Bledsoe, Jarrett Culver out there. I like Isaac Bonga. Eric Paschal from the Jazz from last year is still out there. Perhaps they still need forwards. They have in theory, if they sign Kendall Brown to a spot on the team to offer a guy. If they want to get wing depth in the door, if they want to get a young guy like Bonga, they could still do that. They have the resources and now roster space to do something like that, and they could still move on from one of their superfluous centers in Daniel Tice or Goga Batadze at this stage. Tice makes more sense, but is harder to trade. But they have options with their space. Obviously, Ayton was the preferred option with maximum space, and signing him outright instead of sign and trading him always made more sense to me. Giving up assets to overpay a guy is always tough, even if he is really talented and fits your team really well. But now that they can't get Ayton, their options with their space, assuming they would like to get to the salary floor, which every team basically ever has, except for the Thunder last year. If they don't get to the salary floor, just to get this out of the way, because people will ask, they have to pay the players on their roster an amount to distribute the money up to the salary floor. They will end up paying that amount anyway, but most owners don't like paying players more than the agreed upon amount in their contracts. They like to get up to the salary floor. So the reason I think the Pacers will do something substantial to fill their salary cap space is that, to get to the salary cap floor. But that doesn't mean they sign a free agent or make a trade now. the salary floor is calculated at the end of the season. So the Pacers could go to the trade deadline with all this cap space and say, hey, team's trying to make a big move or clear money or do whatever you're trying to do in a three-team trade. We're here to help. We're here to take your crappy dollars so that you can make a big three-team trade and get it better for the stretch run. That is also possible. So they don't have to use it now. They have the option to do that with the space that they have and have created. And they didn't create a ton today, only like 4 point something million, 4.5-ish million was cleared today. But it's enough, and it's enough that they for sure are under the cap now instead of over. That is noteworthy to talk about the directions that they could now take. And of course, yesterday's show is now much more topical even on the moves the Pacers could make the rest of this offseason because they have space for sure, and all that has been decided. So let's move on to the roster fallout. The Pacers cut some guys. They have a starting center on their team still who has to realize that he just saw all this unfold right before his eyes and is also represented by the exact same agent as Deandre Ayton. Let's talk about the roster fallout for the Pacers as a result of this Deandre Ayton stuff. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On Timberwolves, where CAA client Austin Rivers has agreed to a deal. That's noteworthy because CAA is Myles Turner's agency, is Benedict Matherin's agency. Matherin's agent is one of Ayton's agents. Bill Duffy is Myles Turner's agent, who is Ayton's agent as well. Go to Locked On Minnesota Timberwolves to hear more about Austin Rivers joining that team. So let's talk about the roster fallout. I just wanted to talk about that agency line. With the Pacers now that they have cleared some space for Ayton and didn't get Ayton. I talked about their situation. They have 15 guys under contract and $31 million in space. They also did some moves to be able to sign Deandre Ayton in the first place. The easiest way for the Pacers to clear the cap space to give Ayton the max, the only route, or not the only route, one of the routes they could take, and the cleanest without dealing with another team, was cutting the three minimum guys they got from the Celtics in the Malcolm Brogdon trade, which is Malik Fitz, Nick Stauskas, and Juwan Morgan, and then stretching their salaries. So now all three of those guys are on the Pacers books for the next 3 seasons at a small amount, 700-something thousand for Nick Stauskas, and then a little between 500 and 600,000 for Morgan and Fitz. Those guys cannot be re-signed by the Pacers. They've been waived and stretched. Doing all that got the Pacers close to max space, but just shy. They had 2 non-guaranteed contracts they could cut to get to max space, Dwayne Washington and O'Shea Brissett. Dwayne Washington moved his guarantee date back, if you recall last week, from July 6th to July 15th, meaning his contract was non-guaranteed. Today's the 14th. You're listening probably on the 15th. Pacers cut Washington as well. So they cut Stauskas, Fitz, and Morgan and stretched those deals, and they just cut and waived Dwayne Washington. Did not stretch his deal. It was non-guaranteed, so there was no point of it anyway. But that's noteworthy because the guys they stretched, they cannot sign this season for any reason. They can't sign Fitz, they can't sign Morgan, they can't sign Stauskas this season. But Dwayne Washington got cut, and that really, first of all, human element time. That sucks for Dwayne Washington. Baby on the way, good rookie season. Baby on the way for his girlfriend, wife, I can't remember what she is. Anyway, baby on the way, was looking at buying houses in Indy, and he gets cut as a result of this situation. Human element absolutely sucks. I assume, he was near the top 10 in rookies in scoring last year, was a reliable shooter on 4.5 attempts per game. He will land somewhere in the league. And his contract will be guaranteed in the waiver period. If someone claims him, they get him on the minimum. But if nobody claims him, because his contract is not stretched, the Pacers can, in fact, sign Dwayne Washington again. They could bring him back. Maybe they communicated that with him as part of the push your guarantee date back. I don't know. I would have to ask him about that or someone in the front office. Specifically, I've had more pressing questions to ask. But the Pacers can still re-sign Dwayne Washington if he clears waivers. If someone claims him, they cannot get him back at that point. But he would have his money guaranteed, which is good. He earned that with a good season last year. So it would not stun me at all if Dwayne Washington was back with the Pacers. Weird situation for him that he was the cleanest way for them to get to max space, but they'd probably like to keep him, especially now that they don't have Ayton. I'm sure they would like to have him back, and there's a chance they could if he clears waivers. So a very interesting factor, but if he's claimed, Dwayne Washington, not a Pacer next year. If he goes unclaimed, the Pacers can sign him. And look at this. They have this glut of cap space all of a sudden. Perhaps they could reward him for being jerked around all summer and having his guarantee date moved Would not stun me if Dwayne Washington got like 2 to 2.5, maybe even 3 million this coming season if he comes back to the Pacers as like a small reward for, hey, thanks, sorry about all this, because they have to get to the floor anyway. He was potentially in their plans. He's on their summer league team. We'll see what ends up happening there. But if he does clear waivers, the Pacers can bring him back. The biggest roster fallout, though, and honestly, I probably should have led with this. What the heck is going to happen with Myles Turner here? Look, he had to know about all this happening, obviously. He has the same agent as Ayton, as has been probably overly discussed on this show. And look, when you're getting traded, at least a team is, at looking for your value and things like that. Myles Turner's Instagram story right now says, no noise. He is back in the United States per his Instagram. He was in Africa as part of Brogdon's Family Foundation. But he posted on his Instagram story that he's in Austin, Texas. Anywho, unlike being traded, where a team is getting value for you, in this case, the Pacers, who already promised Jalen Smith the starting power forward spot, were trying to sign an upgrade at Myles Turner's position. This one is a little different than the past situations. Now, Myles Turner has dealt with rumors and roster changes and all that stuff for years. Perhaps he's numb to it. Perhaps it's his Instagram story that I just literally watched. If you're on YouTube, you could see me do it. That says no noise. Doesn't bother him. Perhaps he's numb to that stuff. He's on an expiring deal. No big deal. But this was, again, an obvious, they tried to sign an upgrade situation. So maybe this one makes him a little uncomfortable, or makes him a little more mad, or makes him say, hey, maybe this isn't where I want to be long term if the team would like to have someone else be their center of the future long term. I would reckon that if you don't see the Pacers and Turner agree to an extension really soon after all this, maybe even a renegotiation and extension, because they have the cap space to do that and give him a pay bump this season, I would reckon that he will be dealt either before the season or before the trade deadline because of the message that this sends. They still, again, maybe Turner would like to stay in Indiana, and maybe the Pacers would like to keep Turner, and this is an easily mendable thing. They've tried to trade him before. That's been well reported. They were fielding calls on him this offseason, but weren't like actively shopping him or anything like that. The situation has been what it is, but this one is a little different. They tried to sign an upgrade over him at his position for the long-term starting spot. So if maybe they can agree to an extension or a renegotiation and extension in due time, he is now, again, back in the United States. He could possibly head over to Vegas for the remainder of Summer League or something. I don't know. But he is the guy that I'm the most interested in the fallout of, because if he was already willing to play out his contract this year and enter unrestricted free agency next year, which I think makes a lot of sense for him, one, given that he's never been an unrestricted free agent, and two, that he could probably get more money than he's getting now, especially after seeing Nurkic and Mitchell Robinson get the deals they got. I don't think he would. I don't think he should extend unless he's getting a nice renegotiation and extension package. So what's going to happen with him? He is the biggest roster fallout still on the Pacers as a result of this, right? It cannot be fun to see your starting spot potentially given to someone else, especially when you have given a lot to this franchise for a long time. So I'll be curious what happens with Turner. I'll be curious how they move forward with him and discuss him, because Kalen Cooper tweeted this, and I thought this phrasing was perfect. There's no spinning what this was. There's no saying, oh, we might have wanted to start them together and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's pretty obvious what the Pacers were trying to do. They were trying to sign their long-term center of the future, and they have Myles Turner on their team. So I'll be curious how this works out with Turner, how this works out with the Pacers. I can't wait to talk to people on the record about their relationship and how the communication went on between those two parties, because this has to be fascinating for both of those groups, and I'll be curious in the coming days. I'm talking really short-term future here, just given how this all went down. If the Pacers and Turner agree on an extension, and if they can't, if they either are looking to move him, perhaps in as part of the Donovan Mitchell package or the Kevin Durant package, or if they look to do it during the season, maybe he clicks with Halliburton during the season, they can extend him then. But certainly a situation to monitor going forward as a result of all of this. So I'll be curious by Sunday, because Dwayne Washington was waived on Thursday. He would clear waivers over the weekend if the Pacers can reacquire him, and I'll be curious what the fallout is with Myles Turner. A lot happened today. The Pacers went after Deandre Ayton. They cleared the space to get him, and they didn't. And now they have to figure out what's going to go on with Dwayne Washington. They have to figure out what's going to go on with Myles Turner. They have a ton of cap space and not a lot of needs or obvious free agency fits out there. They should have to pivot and figure out what their team is now. I didn't even get to the big news of today. The Benedict Mathurin Summer League is over because of all this. But next Monday, we'll talk about Summer League thoughts and what happened in Vegas, and then we'll move right on to that stuff. What is the Pacers' next moves with their roster? They have all this space. They have all these questions. What do they do now? What moves make sense? Because there's still a lot to cover with this franchise, who now has a ton of cap space and not a lot of obvious needs to use it with. So we'll see what happens in the coming days, but you'll get all that information here on the Locked On Pacers podcast. If you have questions about how all this went down, because I did speculate a lot today, I don't have all the details about this whole process or anything like that, but I have my hunches based on the cap rules and based on these players. You can hit me up at TEastNBA on Twitter, or comment if you're on YouTube on the YouTube video. That's always a great way to reach me. This podcast is at Locked On Pacers, where we share all the episodes, and there will be a mailbag next week. So when that tweet comes out on Twitter, replying to that is the best way to get questions into the mailbag. Everybody, have a great weekend. If something else happens in Pacerland that requires breaking news this weekend, we'll jump all over it, because perhaps something is imminent given their new team situation. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you soon.